So my story it's kind of a story within a story. The joke when I was growing up is that I was born in a canoe. Both my parents were kind of outdoor enthusiasts. We lived in the country, we went canoeing all the time. And when I was growing up, one of the stories that I always was hearing when I was going to bed was this story about the Arbros Vitae. And I was like, okay, I don't really understand what it's all about, but it actually has a real life place where the story happens. And my family actually went to that place and went canoeing really often there. It's a little place called Magee Lake, and it's right on the edge of Georgian Bay. It's a couple hours north of here, near Honey Harbor. And it actually, the story that I was told from my dad happened when he brought me to this spot, and it was a really magical moment. Because when we went there, so you can imagine kind of this beautiful, perfect Ontario, warm summer, August, right? There's like not a cloud in the sky. If anybody out there likes to canoe, then you know what the feeling is after you spend a day playing in the water and you're eating gorp. It's like good old raisin peanuts, you know, just throwing it in your mouth and eating like slimy, sweaty cheese, and that's like amazing. And you're just kind of feeling the rocks underneath of you, and it's dry, and like every little step you take without shoes on is cutting your feet, but you don't care because you don't have to wear shoes. And so we're sitting on this rock, piece of the Canadian Shield, and there's two little rivers that run in between us from Magee Lake that dump into Georgian Bay. And that's kind of the place where the story of the Arbros Vitae happens. Back kind of around the turn of the century, when that area was actually just for hunting and fishing, that lake actually just had one couple who did all the hunting and fishing there. But really, in that day, it was the man did the hunting and the fishing, and his wife would have taken care of all the cleaning and been actually cleaning everything that he brought home. And so the story goes that one day he went out hunting, and he actually came across the tracks of a bear, which is like the greatest thing ever if you're a hunter, because you can use everything of a bear and it will keep you fed for over a year, really. And it was a big one. You could tell from the prints that you could see in the soft ground all around. And so he tracked it all day long because it meant so much. But what he didn't realize is that the bear was actually smarter than him. And it actually double backed on him. And so he came across it in a surprise, and it attacked him, and it mauled him. And he was, well, you can imagine, mauled by a bear. You're bleeding, you're cut open, you don't know what's going on. Delirium, right? It's a whole new world. You were just walking through the forest, and all of a sudden, you're near death. And what he did is, he was obviously a very, very strong man, and he had the will to live. And he crawled out of the forest, back down to the edge of the lake where he had his rowboat, because at that time motorboats were just an oddity. And he actually was able to physically start rowing himself across the lake. And he came just about halfway, and his wife could see that there was something terribly, terribly wrong. There was something horribly wrong, because he was all, you know, moving kind of weird, and probably could hear him groaning and moaning as he was making his way across. And he actually got over to the side of the cabin so she could get down to him, and she looked down at her husband and saw, oh my God, like he's dying. What do I do? We're in the middle of the wilderness. At this time there was maybe 2 or 3 boats that would come by in Georgian Bay that were these old steamers for the really rich tourists that wanted to come up and cabin there. And that was the only option she had. She thought, this is what I have to do. I have to get in the boat, I have to row him over to this spot where Magee Lake dumps into Georgian Bay, and hopefully somebody will come by and save him. That's her only hope. So she uses all of her strength that she possibly can. You can imagine seeing this little tiny wooden boat with a man who is bleeding all over the place, probably moaning and groaning something that you've never imagined. And all you can do is muster up the strength to have to stare at him and row yourself probably a good half an hour to this spot where your only hope is that a random boat might come by. And so she gets there, and unfortunately, later in the summer actually, the water level goes down enough that those 2 little rivers that go around that rock that separates Magee Lake from the rest of Georgian Bay are too low that you can't get a boat down. So she pulls up to the rock, and she has just used all of her energy. She's spent. And she realizes she can't go any further. that's the end of her road. She got to that point and she tries to figure out if she can drag the boat back into the water or something, but it just isn't going to work. The boat's too big, the river's too small. So she drags his body, his limp, dying body, up onto the rock, and she just sits there. She wonders, like, I've done everything. What else can I do? This is my last hope. And up until that point in her life, she lived in the woods. She was completely non-religious whatsoever, not spiritual even. And she thought, you know what, my only last hope is just to pray. So she got down on her hands and knees and said, and did it, I don't know exactly what she said, really, I wasn't there. But apparently, she got down on her hands and knees and prayed and said, God, if you can save my husband's life, I will build a shrine on the rock right there so that people can come and pay the respects that I guess you deserve for the fact that you will give me this miracle of my husband's life. And apparently within minutes, one of those boats came by and she was able to flag it down, and they took him to Collingwood and his life was saved. And they lived out the rest of their life back in McCrae Lake hunting. And every time I went to that lake, so that was the story that I was told, and it's a story that runs throughout my whole life. But the really incredible part about this rebirth story is actually in that whole region. If you go, you can go and visit McCrae Lake. It's a really popular spot. There's a lot of different kinds of trees that you can recognize on the Canadian Shield, one of which is not that common are cedars, except that they kind of grow in these clumps, and McCrae Lake didn't have a lot of these. And as soon as she regained her health and came back, or sorry, her husband regained her health and came back, she did build this little shrine. And I actually have a picture of it from a canoe trip that I did, so that you can, if you go to McCrae Lake, you know exactly where you're going. It's there's only one place where it dumps into Georgian Bay, and there's a little blue shrine with a Mother Mary. The rock's repainted every year, and there are wreaths and all sorts of little messages and stuff there. But the thing that was most incredible to me about the rebirth of this is that after that shrine was built, cedar trees started to grow all around it. And the neat thing about that my dad always reminds me of, is that there's this real amazing connection between that kind of spiritual story of real life living, where you're fighting for your life every moment, and you're somebody who lives off the land, but eventually the land kicks you back. But there is a cycle of rebirth that continuously happens, and it's recognized a lot in that tree, and it always reminds me of it, because the cedar tree is called the Arbros Vitae. It's the tree of life. And it was given that name partly because when the Europeans first came over, a lot of them died of scurvy because they were eating really crappy stuff. They were getting scurvy, dying, couldn't eat. And they realized that actually if you scrub your gums with them as well, then you can get your vitamin C and you can survive. But for a lot of reasons, I find when I go through my life and I think about that, that sitting back on that rock and brought back to that place, and I go through, I mean, as you've heard already tonight, so many stories of trials and tribulations and the weird things and the fun things, but that birth and rebirth is continuously happening. And I always remember that place, sitting on that rock, being with my parents, my family, and feeling that incredible depth of connection that I don't know if I've ever felt it anywhere else before. But every time I try to make sure that I reach out and touch the leaves of a cedar whenever I see it, and just am reminded of the fact that we are constantly in the cycle of birth and rebirth.